Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am very excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Julie F.K. and Kathryn Kolbert discussing their new book, Controlling Women, What We Must Do Now to Save Reproductive Freedom. They are joined tonight in conversation by Mary Ziegler. Through good times and bad, Harvard Bookstore will continue to bring authors and their work to our virtual community. Our fall season is in full swing and you don't want to miss our lineup. Make sure to check out our event schedule on harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows at the end of the event. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Controlling Women, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you'd like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Without your continued support and patronage, this virtual author series wouldn't be possible. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors, our incredible booksellers, and our landmark independent bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support, especially now. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Julie F.K. helped lay the groundwork for the legalization of abortion in Ireland through the first direct challenge to the country's absolute ban on abortion before the European Court of Human Rights. Julie began her legal career at the Center for Reproductive Rights and has spent the ensuing decades developing innovative legal and policy initiatives to advance gender equality and religious freedom. Kathryn Kolbert has made her second appearance before the Supreme Court in 1992, arguing Planned Parenthood versus Casey. She co-founded the Center for Reproductive Rights, and she founded NPR's Justice Talking and the Athena Center for Leadership at Barnard College. They are joined tonight by Mary Ziegler. Mary is one of the world's leading historians of the abortion debate in the United States. She's the author of 3 books, including the award-winning After Roe, and she also has a new book coming out next summer. Tonight, they're discussing Controlling Women. We are in a terrifying moment in the United States concerning women's reproductive health and safety. When Roe is toppled, abortion may quickly become a criminal offense in nearly 1/3 of the United States. At this make or break moment for legal abortion in the United States, Kitty and Julie's purpose is they bring audacious new strategies inspired by medical advances, state-level protections, human rights models, and activists across the globe whose courage and determination are making a difference. Without further ado, I'll turn things over to our speakers. Kitty, Julie, Mary, thank you so much for joining us tonight. The virtual stage is yours.
Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thanks for having us. So this book has a little bit of everything. It has some history and looking backward, but it also, I think, significantly at a time when there's a lot going on. It has some sort of what we should do now, which is a question I've been asked a lot. So we can begin by looking backward. So Kitty, you were involved in a case that a lot of people have never heard of, right? So this conversation, and even Audrey in introducing us, talked about Roe v. Wade. So would you mind telling me a little bit about Roe v. Wade and a little bit about how Roe v. Wade in some ways is already no longer with us because of a case you worked on called Planned Parenthood versus Casey?
Sure. Thanks, Mary, and thanks to everybody who are here tuning in. And we hope to have an optimistic conversation despite the difficult news that we are facing. But as you all know, in 1973, the Supreme Court issued Roe versus Wade, and it established, I like to say, the highest level of constitutional protection that any right enjoys. And the right was framed as the right to privacy, but really it encompassed both the decision to have an abortion and the decision to carry a pregnancy to term. And over the years, Roe was attacked over and over again by state legislatures who passed restrictive laws, but managed to sustain itself, giving a high-level constitutional protection, keeping abortion legal in all of the states in the country. In 1992, I had the honor of representing the abortion clinics in Pennsylvania in a challenge to a number of restrictions that were on the books in that state. I'd done an earlier case in 1986, almost identical to the 92 case, but the significant difference was the court had changed. Justice Clarence Thomas had been appointed to the court, and court watchers at the time, and including all of my legal team, believed that there were 5 votes on the Supreme Court to overturn Roe at that time. Now, I say all the time, arguing in front of the Supreme Court, winning in front of the Supreme Court is just about like Sesame Street. Why? Because you got to learn to count. And there's only one number that matters, and that is 5. So at the time, in 1991 and 1992, we believed there were 5 justices on the court to overturn Roe. In fact, after the argument, the justices went back and voted, and there were 5 votes to overturn Roe. Justice Rehnquist wrote a draft opinion overturning Roe, but Justice Kennedy at the last minute changed his vote. And he, along with Justice O'Connor and Souter, issued what's called a joint opinion, which is very rare in the Supreme Court, where 3 justices get together and author one opinion. But what they did is they reaffirmed what they called the hallmarks of Roe, but at the same time, they gave states greater latitude to restrict abortion and adopted what many people know of as the undue burden test. Over the years, in the last 30 years, the meaning of what's an undue burden changed as state legislators became more conservative, as judges became more conservative. And today, and we're going to talk more about this, many women have very difficult times obtaining abortions in many states. Abortions available only in 89%, is not available in 89% of the counties in this country. And so access is very limited, and many, many women are affected as a result.
That's great. And can I ask you one follow-up before I ask Julie a question? I'm curious why people don't know that Casey is why are we still talking about Roe? Because that's something, and I'm curious about your thoughts on that too, Julie, because when these conversations are all framed around Roe, even though in some ways we've moved beyond it.
Well, for 2 reasons, I think. First of all, it's a name that everybody knew before Casey. And trying to explain the change in a legal standard is a very legalistic approach. It doesn't, it's not easy to understand for most people. So it's a lot easier just to say Roe, even though Casey changed Roe in some ways. But ultimately, I think what most people think about Roe is its federal constitutional protection that allows abortion in all 50 states to be legal. It's no longer criminalized. And I think when people use the shorthand Roe, that's what they mean. And in fact, Casey did permit that going forward. But it's like, it doesn't sound so good to say Roe versus Wade is modified by the Supreme Court and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Yeah, it doesn't work.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, and Julie, I wanted to ask you about the title of the book, which is provocative, the controlling women. So I was curious why this title, and what you think, and I kind of relatedly, why the book centers some on abortion, right? Because as you know, there's been in recent years in particular, conversations about whether people who are supporters of reproductive rights and justice have focused too much on abortion, right, to the exclusion of other things. So I guess, what is it about abortion that's uniquely important that you wanted to spotlight in the book?
Well, first of all, I just want to say how glad I am to be here. I am from Boston, so Harvard Bookstore has meant a lot to me. And I got my women's studies degree across the street many, many years ago. And everybody always told me I'd never get a job with a women's studies degree. So there's a certain nice connection to the bookstore and to the academic mind here. We called the book Controlling Women because we really feel that abortion and abortion restrictions and reproductive freedom are about those kinds of decisions about who gets to have children when, who has to have children with whom, or whether to, who gets to make that decision. And it really is often based on traditional ideas of what gender roles are, that women as caregivers, men as breadwinners, and these kind of very binary ideas that really don't serve anyone well. And so there's been a lot of conversation about abortion as a religious issue or a deeply philosophical question about when life begins. And, in writing this book, we really felt that's not really what's at stake here. What's at stake are human rights and the decisions over bodily integrity, over whether you participate in the world, in getting an education, in making these decisions about parenting, and really the basic right to dignity about making decisions over one's own body and life choices. And so, this, I think in some ways, Mary, ties back to what you were saying about why don't people know about Casey. I think a lot of it is that it's simpler just to think about Roe, but there's a little bit of an insidious part to it as well, in that after Casey, the restrictions that were passed have been really harmful for a lot of women and people seeking abortions. And those have been women on the margins, low-income women, teens, people in rural areas, and has had a disproportionate effect on women of color who lack access to reproductive health care. So when you're putting extra burdens on people who are seeking a needed healthcare service, it doesn't fall fairly. So things have not been good for a while, and they're certainly going to get worse with this current Supreme Court.
Right. That's a great transition to what I was going to talk about next, because as you know, abortion at the moment is still legal, even in places near where I am in Florida, like Alabama and Georgia. But as the book points out, that's decreasingly true, right? Because of the kinds of restrictions that Casey has authorized. And also is likely to become even more true, as the Supreme Court is likely to either, take a step toward reversing Roe this year in a Mississippi case that has before it, or just reverses Roe entirely. And so I was curious, I mean, I have thoughts on this as a historian, but I was curious, how do you think we got here to a world where this is so different even from the one really that we were in 92 in Casey? I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that, but that would be, I'd be interested.
Well, we got here largely because of Mitch McConnell and the election of Donald Trump as president, because he had three he had three nominations to the court that changed the margin. But we also got here because the anti-abortion movement developed a 40-year plan that they've been implementing over those last, it's almost nearly 50 years now. And that plan was to not only chip away at the margins of Roe by going after first poor women by passing the Hyde Amendment and other restrictions on funding, or young women by requiring parental notification and consent, or looking at clinic regulations and jumping on board with lots and lots of restrictions. They had a strategy and they were very good at it. And I think one of the critiques we say in the book over and over again is our strategy was always save Roe, save Roe, save Roe. And that's a legal strategy that today will no longer work. And it's time to find a new one, because our protection is not going to come from the court going forward. Our protection is going to come from having the political power to make sure that these restrictions are eliminated, and having the political power to make sure that women have a whole range of reproductive health care.
Yeah, I mean, that really resonates with me, because I think in studying this as a historian, I'm always struck by the save Roe, save Roe, save Roe. There's evidence of that everywhere. And I wonder why you think that happened, because I mean, I think there were people at various points in the history who sort of, raised a hand and said, maybe we're not. Yeah, right. I mean, you being an obvious example, saying, and I mean, even in the 90s during Casey, saying that there was this sort of over-reliance on the courts. And I mean, I would even say, I think there's an over-reliance on the courts on the right at the moment. I mean, there's a sort of almost insanely naive optimism about what the Supreme Court can do for you without political change. And so I'm curious what you think, where you think that comes from, why this sort of allure or obsession with saving Roe to the exclusion sometimes of doing necessary political work, why that's been so persistent.
Well, I mean, I think a couple of things. First of all, it has not been used politically as successfully from the abortion rights side as the anti-abortion side. I mean, the right has used this as a wedge issue remarkably successfully. People vote anti-abortion, constantly. They ignored so many of Donald Trump's sins because they were going to get the 3 Supreme Court justices that they did. So part of it is this is an important issue to many people, but they don't vote like it is, or they settle for people who say, oh, of course I'm pro-choice, and they tick the box, but they don't care if we deny Medicaid funding for abortion. It took President Biden a long time to come around on that one, and he has because of political pressure, and particularly from some newly elected and not so newly elected Black women in Congress who were really pointing out how harmful that was. So there have been other avenues, but I think the court, this has been where these battles have been played out. Kitty and I have spent a lot of time in those court fights, and it was, I think after Planned Parenthood versus Casey that things were chipped away. And we talk a lot in the book about there's sort of a chapter on every different kind of restriction, some of which were legal, like waiting periods. Others were attacks on doctors, attacks on clinics, assassination of staff, those kinds of horrific violence. But at the end of the day, the biggest victories have been in the court for the anti-abortion movement. And it was, as Kitty said, part of a strategy. And I think, it's important that we learn what those restrictions are and what those strategies are, but that also we broaden our own approach significantly.
I would also add, Mary, that liberals love great policy. People on my side of the political divide will talk policy till you're blue in the face. But for some reason, politics, or the actually getting people elected so that you can enact that policy is less important. Some of that is because they live in blue states where those politicians are already in office, but it's also because it just feels kind of dirty and messy to get involved in politics as opposed to policy. And I think we need to change that. We now know that voting rights is a women's issue. We now know that you can't get anything done unless you have political power. But, it's taken a long time for liberals to come to that view.
Right, that makes sense. And I wonder, relatedly, I guess, do you think we're seeing, obviously there's a lot about this just in the past few days, and we already have some people in Q&A who are going to be asking about this, but I was wondering if you could situate SB 8, which, just for those who may not, I'm not sure how you could have not heard of it at this point, but assuming you've been blessed to not have to talk about SB 8 as often as we probably have in recent weeks. SB 8 is a Texas law that bans abortion when fetal cardiac activity can be detected, which is usually around 2 weeks after someone could even feasibly know they're pregnant, often probably even before that. And the law outsources enforcement to literally anyone, right? So it doesn't even have to be someone in Texas. And the Supreme Court, we now have heard, has put this on the sort of rocket docket and is going to hear oral argument on it in November. So this has been all over the news. Do you see that this Texas law as being sort of part of the same story, that of sort of, I guess, a combination of strategy misfires by people on the abortion rights side and some successful moves by the anti-abortion rights side? Or how do you understand where we are with this Texas law?
I think that the Texas law is the toddler that comes into the room and has the tantrum and disrupts everything. And it's brought all of our attention. And, instead of the Supreme Court saying, okay, go to bed now, they said, oh, well, let's see what happens if we just let it run around the living room for a while. And so it's a huge problem. It's a very creative law, so to speak, by the anti-abortion movement. It's unprecedented in some really startling ways. And the Supreme Court's job is to say, let's put it on hold, let's figure out if it's constitutional. And instead, the majority said, well, we don't know what's going on, we'll let it run its course. And it's playing a really deadly game with women in Texas. But it's part of a bigger concern. It's part of what has been coming down the pipeline, for a decade or so. It's part of what's on the Supreme Court's docket for December 1st of the Mississippi case that's going to look at whether they can ban abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy, even though there is no second trimester abortion in Mississippi already because they've run providers out. But I think it's part of a bigger package. It's hard to predict in the tea leaves which way the court is going to go, but the purpose of our book was really to say they're not going to be our friends. They're not going to do anything but harm, whether they do it in one fell swoop or not, whether they try to look reasonable by putting the Texas toddler to bed and, looking at Mississippi and cutting out later, second trimester abortion. It's hard to say because we've been so surprised at what they've done with Texas. But I think Texas is a sort of different level as far as what you mentioned with the enforcement, allowing anybody to go after somebody who assists or aids a woman who seeks an abortion. And I think that's part of the bigger stigmatization of abortion rights, that it's not just the person having the abortion, but even the guidance counselor who helps her, the clergy member who helps her, the next door neighbor, the aunt, the older sister. It's really trying to chill anybody who might see this as a right and see this as something that's necessary in an individual situation and clamp down on that. So the Supreme Court has already implicitly given the green light or explicitly green lighted it by letting it go into effect.
Yeah, Mary, so I disagree with Julie in some ways, which is I'm very clear there's 5 votes on this court to uphold or to reverse Casey and Roe. I think they'll do that in the Mississippi case. The only question in November about Texas on the ballot is who has the power to bring the lawsuit. They're not really looking at whether or not the law is constitutional. It's a very limited review. So I think it's a bit of a red herring. It's a good red herring in the sense that it gets people to understand how dire a situation we are in. But it is the Mississippi case that's likely to overturn Casey and Roe. And let me just add one quick thing about that, which is let's not get so excited about Texas that we avoid the bigger problem, which is once the court gives states latitude to ban abortion, many states, as many as 27 in our view, are likely to pass bans on abortion. And those bans may be like the Texas ban, or they could just be a complete ban altogether, and people in all of those states will have difficulty having access to abortion.
Right. And I mean, just so I don't know if everyone is familiar with the Mississippi case, but I think because Texas, the sort of the toddler is Julie, I love that too. I think that's like a perfect.
I hope I'm not triggering anybody by mentioning toddler tantrum.
No, I have a toddler, but you're not triggering me. I just think it's really apt because it's all anyone wants to talk about, even though I think it's actually of the cases the less important of the two. So would you mind telling people who may not be familiar with it what the sort of the question in the Mississippi case is, so people can understand why it looks like it's going to be such a big deal?
Yeah, I mean, the Mississippi case is a ban. And as we talked about earlier with Casey, you're allowed to burden you could access to abortion, but you can't outright ban it. Although there have been certain methods of abortion that have been allowed to be banned. And so this is a pretty blatantly, normally unconstitutional law. It's what we say wouldn't pass a first-year law exam. It's clearly a ban on something that Roe would have permitted, and Casey didn't annihilate. And still, this is just the law that made it first to the Supreme Court because it's coming out of the Fifth Circuit, which gave the green light to the law to go ahead. And so we're not necessarily, there's nothing special about it, I guess. I mean, the Texas law is also more special and interesting. This is just kind of an outright, serving up the Supreme Court because they know the justices have changed. They know that there's a ultra-conservative anti-abortion majority of, definitely 5 votes, likely 6. And so it's not good, but as we've said, it means sort of probably the worst case scenario would be an overturning of Roe and turning it back to the states. And I think we need to be really clear in case, for non-lawyers, but also for generally our own strategy's sake, that the Supreme Court is the floor, not the ceiling. So they can allow states to criminalize abortion, but states, good states, so to speak, blue states like Massachusetts and others can still have legal abortion services, can fund them, can support people traveling. But as Kitty said, that's the minority of states. So it's nothing, it's still a major problem, but it's not that the day, the Supreme Court releases its opinion that abortion will be lights out in America.
So Mary, let me just add one other thing, which is lawyers often talk about what's called a standard of review. That is, how does the court look at a particular statute? What will it permit? And there's no way to uphold the Mississippi law without changing that standard, giving states more and more latitude to restrict. So even if they just say this 15-week ban is constitutional, that just means that we'll have states passing 13-week bans and 12-week bans and 6-week bans, because they're all in this fight to test the margins of what the court has done. That's why we say over and over again, quit relying on the courts, begin to develop the political infrastructure that makes sure states can't continue to pass these restrictive laws.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask you, Julie, because one of the things that's striking, if we look abroad, even this year, in the past few years, we've seen Argentina move toward legalizing abortion. We've seen the Mexican Supreme Court just in the past couple of months move to recognizing protections for abortion. And so one of the things that I think is really fascinating in the book is that you look to the example of Ireland and your work there as a way of sort of thinking beyond this sort of court-centered framework that people have gotten stuck in. So would you mind telling me a little bit about that work and what you learned from it?
Sure. And, I do think it's a relevant model, and it's an uplifting one in many ways. I lived in Ireland when there was a complete ban on abortion. There was a provision in the Irish Constitution that equated the life of a fertilized egg with that of the pregnant woman. And there was no abortion in Ireland, even in life-saving circumstances. And what we had was called the Irish solution to the Irish problem, which meant that they exported abortion rights. Women traveled to England as well as to other countries in Europe. And it wasn't easy. And it also led to kind of the criminalization of abortion led to kind of a chill over maternal health care. And I brought a lawsuit to the European Court of Human Rights, which is the premier human rights enforcement body in Europe. It controls the law of 45 other countries, challenging this on this ban as a violation of women's human rights. And we brought it on behalf of 3 women in very different situations. And I think this is really important because women have abortions for a variety of reasons. And we didn't want to just have one woman in the spotlight. We wanted to really put the whole issue in front of the court. Ultimately, they found on behalf of one of my clients. And along the way, we were really able to put the debate into human rights terms. So it was at the court that it was being argued as a violation of the European Convention, but it allowed us to go into politicians and talk about this as a human rights issue. It wasn't a Catholics versus, heathens or whatever else we were accused of being. It wasn't philosophical about the beginning of life. And that led to a more mass movement, which was particularly sparked by a tragic case of a woman named Savita Halappanavar, who had a wanted pregnancy and had a miscarriage, that she went to the hospital for treatment. And, as we're looking at these fetal heartbeat bans in Texas, in that case, her physicians could still detect a heartbeat, so they wouldn't treat her. And they delayed and they delayed. And eventually she died from sepsis. And it was a tragic, horrible waste of horrible indecision, and ruined this couple's lives, obviously, but really reverberated and led to mass protests, and eventually to a referendum that voted in favor of legalizing abortion rights. And that was 3 years ago. And abortion is fully legal in the first trimester of pregnancy. The provision was struck from the Constitution, which was the main victory. And they've now been working towards provide free contraception. There's been a real wave of support. And I think, when I look at this, I see this really as a model of how we start talking about this issue and how we start acting politically and in the streets, as well as in the courts, that it is a sort of trifecta approach. But it's really a new framework, and one that I think would work well in this country, and one of human rights framework that the reproductive justice movement has been talking about for decades in this country. That's the movement that is in favor of reproductive rights, that's led by women of color, Black women led, that have been talking about the human right to have an abortion or to have a baby and to raise a family in safety and economic security. And so it's, I think, one of the real ways forward on this issue in this country, and certainly has been, as you noted, in Argentina and in Poland and other countries, in Mexico, as a result of some of these mass movements.
Right, that's really helpful. So I wanted to talk about the sort of lessons moving forward for this, right? So if we're relying too much on the court and we have these examples from abroad to draw on, what should we be doing at a moment like this? Like, sort of, what are some of the political strategies that you think would be the most effective?
So I think the we kind of think of the kinds of things we need to do in three categories. First and foremost, help the women in those states where abortion will be banned. And that there's a whole range of ways we can do that. I want to come back, hopefully, Mary, to talk a little bit about medication abortion and how we can make that more available, and how we can help women travel, and we can provide funding, et cetera, to women in the states where abortion is banned. The second, and I think category, really goes to the politics of this issue. And it's how we win back control of the state legislatures and have enough of a margin in Congress to pass national protection. As I said earlier, I think 27 states, which are controlled primarily by the Republicans, all anti-abortion by wide margins. They have a governor who's anti-abortion. Those are the states we're going to see the bans. A number of them have already passed those bans, and others will just do so very quickly after they're given the green light to do so. There's about 17 states that are blue. I use that as shorthand, but basically are pro-choice, that they have legislatures who believe in women's equality, and they can pass laws that protect women and protect the ability to obtain a whole range of reproductive health services. And so in those states, we want to cut back on the current restrictions that are on the books, give a statutory protection for Roe, maybe have state constitutional protection implemented, and really go full hog on making access available to good health services for women, including birth control, including medication abortion, and importantly, including a whole range of services that make choosing childbirth appropriate: child care, maternal and child health services, etc. And we talk a lot in the book about how you got to talk, policy has to be broader than just abortion. But the key in those states is, do you have the political power to implement these things? And that's just a question of getting down and dirty in the political system. And if I do nothing else tonight, it is to ensure that all of the people who are watching know that you can help elect pro-choice people around this country from your dorm room, from your living room, from your neighbor's house. You can make phone calls, you can canvass, you can send postcards, you can send money, all of the very basics. And there are over 5,000 offices in this electoral offices in this country, from school boards to town councils to state legislatures to Congress people. And we need to put champions of choice in all of them.
Right. And oh, go ahead, Julie. Were you gonna? I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, I think it's, so we talked in the book, I think there's, somebody counted, somebody not us, but 50 something different solutions. And the overarching theme is do something. We're always preaching to the choir, because people who are coming and listening and learning, they get a check for today, I guess. But the first part is really, I think, realizing what is going on, learning more about it, and bringing in other allies, because we're going to need a lot more people on this, and everybody can do something. Some people are going to be looking to help people who are traveling, helping women to, find places to stay overnight, and funding for abortion services, particularly in blue states. Blue states like Massachusetts, where you have abortion rights, you have a great act that was passed that protects women's health and sort of codifies Roe, but there still isn't enough access access to abortion services, and especially medication abortion. So one of the bills that is really, one of my favorites is in California, the all state universities are required to have medication abortion available. So we often, when we're talking to college students and other people, are just, what about asking your university, why is it not available? And what about these doc in a boxes that have provided such vital care during COVID? Those have extended hours so that women who have responsibilities or low-wage workers can really access medication abortion more easily. It makes it easier for people who are traveling from out of state for abortion services. So it's really looking at a range and a host of different types of activism. I always like the creative younger ones. There was a response in Texas. Some TikTokers were trying to flood the Texas anti-abortion website where you would report people for allegedly helping somebody have an abortion. I know TikTok, I don't know how to flood it or anything or go viral. So everybody brings different skills to it. And, our message is it's really important now more than ever to do something and pick something that works for you so it's sustainable.
Yeah, I wanted, in terms of types of things you could do, I wanted to come back to a point Kitty made about, what would be different this time if states, as we expect, somewhere between 20 and 27, maybe more. I mean, who knows? I mean, I live in Florida where they may follow suit. I mean, which states are going to criminalize abortion, I think is unclear, but it's clear that a lot of them will. So I guess one question would be, is it going to be the same this time around when abortion is illegal? And just in sort of short-term ways, what are some of the more concrete ways people can help if someone is trying to go from a state where abortion is illegal to somehow access care?
So, Mary, the good news, if there is good news in any of this, is that in the days before Roe, women had to turn to back alley illegal abortions, surgical abortions that, frankly, when performed by illicit practitioners, meant that women lost their fertility and some died. Today, medication abortion is available. You can terminate a pregnancy by taking a series of 2 pills. It's basically safe. It's good to have medical backup. It's good to have good counseling about what this means and how you do it. It would be good if it was legal in every state, but it won't be. But what we must do, in my view, is we need to flood the states where it is available and help women get those pills in any way that they can. Now, there's groups like Aid Access that Julie's friends with the doc that created the boat off the coast of Ireland. I'll let her tell that story. But frankly, women can go online and talk to a doctor and order pills and have them sent into the state. That may be illegal to send it from Texas to Texas. It's not as clear what the legality is from a good state to a bad. And all of those questions are going to have to be ironed out. But the best thing we can do is increase the availability. Let me just give you an example. There are 800 abortion clinics in this country. That's it, 800. There are, on the other hand, 7,500 or almost 8,000 what we think of as the minute clinics, the docs in the box, the place you can go on weekends that are in rural areas that are in the cities. Every health center, every health system is now opening these kinds of primary care clinics. CVS is opening them. If all of those places in the blue states had access to medication abortion and actually prescribed medication abortion, we would do a lot to increase access for the women in the states where it is banned, because they can call their friend in New York and say, get me some pills. And that's an important thing. To me, I always say to people who want to do something is start at home. Does Harvard University have medication abortion in its clinics? And if not, make sure they do. Start organizing all the campuses in Massachusetts. Start putting pressure on places that are run by primary care centers that are run by local hospital systems. The right is never afraid to push their cause. And I think we need to do that too.
Right.
Yeah, I think the access question of getting people to a blue state or abortion sanctuaries or hubs, however we want to phrase it, is going to be more important than ever. In New York, there is funding that was granted by the city council that went to a philanthropic abortion fund to support people who are traveling with related expenses. We also want to encourage states to provide abortion funding for people who, so there's the direct funding for the procedure, but there's also the related costs. People are used to traveling in some ways already. Kitty mentioned the Women on Waves abortion ship that I was part of in Ireland. That was a project when abortion was completely banned. It was a clinic outfitted on a ship, and you would come into harbor and pick women up and go 12 miles out into international waters to provide legal abortion. It was also really an awareness raising tool back then about the Irish journey and the exporting of the problem. But I think that kind of creativity, and we're not all going to be doing activities that are legal. And so, when you're looking at people engaging in activities and who gets prosecuted, the more something is brought into the criminal justice system, the more there is racial inequality and inequality according to resources and representation. So it is going to be standing up more and really framing this as a rights-based issue, getting some of the businesses and corporations who might speak up loudly on other issues but won't touch abortion with a barge pole to really start demanding, we're not going to Texas this month because of the ban. We've seen that happen with voting rights. We've seen Black Lives Matter. We have just tremendous allies in corporate America and in bringing in other activists. Similarly, the LGBTQ plus movement in rallying people around marriage equality. It's time to really start working closely with our allies and broadening this issue of abortion into one of reproductive freedom, but being more demanding of it at the same time.
Yeah,
Right.
so Mary, I would add, we need to make a lot of noise. I mean, the fact is Texas passed this law and it didn't make national news for months until it was about to go into effect. It should have been national news when they were passing this thing.
Mm-hmm.
So every time a state legislator brings up this kind of issue, every time it's on a floor, we need to flood those state houses with people who can demonstrate that they oppose what's going on. And women in blue states need to help the women in red states to make that happen. But making noise is a really effective strategy, and it's the one that's ultimately going to show that we can resist and must resist these incursions on our liberty.
Right. Well, one of the questions in Q&A I wanted to kind of use as a bridge to something else I wanted to talk about in the book, which is the sort of long-term plan. So one of the people in the audience asked, what's the timeline to getting these rights back when they're gone? And one of the things, the sort of longer term strategy you outline in the book was to have some kind of like an actual constitutional amendment that deals with gender equity in pretty capacious ways. So I was hoping you could talk about, both answer the question about what is the timeline in your minds for that kind of change, and then also describe a little bit what you imagine this constitutional amendment could look like.
I like that timing question a lot. I don't think it's one we've gotten before. I once, when I was in Ireland, was asking about the budget for something and said, well, how much do we need? And my boss said, well, how long is a piece of string? So I think that's kind of a very hard question to determine. It's sort of, how active can you get? How quickly can you move forward? In response to the Texas ban, the Congress, the House of Representatives did pass the Women's Health Protection Act, not likely at all to move through the Senate. How long does it take to change the Senate? So I think we're looking at a long, cold spell that's going to need other solutions. And one of the reasons that we talk about adding a gender equity amendment to the Constitution is this longer term plan, and one that's going to be more of sort of a fix, get us where we want to go, a lot more than the privacy rights provision in that came through Roe v. Wade. Really makes this more of a gender equity issue, accommodates racial equity more, kind of thinks about more holistically what is at stake in reproductive freedom. It's going to take a lot of the right people being in office to vote for it, but we do think of it as a long-term plan, and one that will take a constitution that was not designed by any means with gender or race equity in mind, and really modernizes it and is human rights infused, as far as it puts an obligation on the government to do more than just close its eyes to letting things get enacted in Texas and those other kinds of harms that we've seen recently. I don't think that's the only way to get back to protecting our rights on a national level. I think that's a longer term plan that would really let us go forward and have the security that those rights and other rights to be free from sexual violence and workplace discrimination are solidly in the Constitution and not in federal statutes or sort of in a penumbra of privacy rights that we currently are.
Right. And so my view is it took the anti-abortion movement nearly 50 years to get what they wanted with kind of laser focus on the courts. We need to change not only what the law is, but what who makes those laws. And that change can come quickly or it can come slowly. The more people that are involved, the harder you work, the quicker it comes. And there's no other easy answer than that. I do think, and I think this is important, is that we've seen in social movements is that there are often inflection points. In Ireland, it was the death of a woman who had a wanted pregnancy. In the racial justice movement, obviously, it was the death of George Floyd. There are many inflection points in the marriage equality movement over the years. But I think and Texas in some ways has become an inflection point on this issue because people are so outraged by what they did. But at the same time, we need to make those inflection points. Every time a state passes a bad law, every time we are asking for something that ought to just be a normal thing and are denied the ability to get that, I think can be a roadmap for us on how we move forward.
Right. And I think and just before I ask the next question, if you're in the audience and you have questions, this is sort of the official Q&A window. So please feel free to add them in the Q&A function and I'll make sure to ask them. Someone had a Texas specific question. So one of the sort of weird features of Texas's law is that it allows people to sue not only those who perform abortions, but also those who aid or abet folks who perform abortions. And so the person in the audience, Mike, wanted to know if does Texas extend to out-of-state abortions, or number one, right? So if an abortion is performed outside of Texas, can the person be sued? And then second, if the abortion is performed in Texas and someone, for example, in the audience today wanted to give to Planned Parenthood in Texas, could they be sued? So I think they're trying to get a sense of how far this law goes. And in particular, if they wanted to donate money, could they be sued? I think is also probably behind the question.
Well, as to affecting abortions outside the state, no, the law doesn't apply to that. As to aiding and abetting, we don't know how extensive that will be. Obviously, people from outside Texas have brought some of the first suits against providers. So we don't really know how far it will go. But I can tell you that donating your money is considered a First Amendment right. And I would think the court would have to be, any court would have to be really, really bad to not include protection for First Amendment rights outside this statute. So talking about the issue and giving money, it seems to me, would probably be protected. But again, I can't give legal advice on this because we just don't know.
We can give medical advice, but not legal advice. But, and it's also a lot of what we write about in the book are cases that we've had that really struck us that were on behalf of individual folks where they were kind of being outside, the law was being twisted and contorted, and they were being given a hard time just for even assisting somebody. So we talk about a case that Kitty did on behalf of a woman named Rosa Hartford, who was criminally prosecuted under a Child Custody Protection Act for taking a young woman in her community and driving her to an abortion clinic. The nearest one was in New York. The girl lived in Pennsylvania, far outside of Philadelphia. And so we look at cases like that where it just takes one really excited and rogue prosecutor or 2 or 10 of them, and it starts creating this chill. And the fact that, you would question giving money or helping somebody or giving somebody a ride is exactly what these laws are aimed to do. And so, you get situations where you have, doctors as well as activists who really don't know which way to go forward. I had a case I talk about in the book of on behalf of a woman named Michelle Lee, who had a life-threatening heart condition. And she went to her doctors at Louisiana State University when she was pregnant, and she had been told not to get pregnant, but contraceptives fail and people fail and things happen. And they wouldn't treat her because they said they can only do abortions if a person's life was at risk and she didn't have a greater than 50% chance of dying. So the National Abortion Federation transported her by ambulance at a cost of over $10,000 and got her treated in Texas. And then when I was at the center, we brought the case on her behalf. And it was just, there's so many examples of this overstepping and overreaching that happens even outside the law. And even now, that when you pass something like Texas, that's just really intended to shut things down, it can be very effective, both formally as well as through informal effects.
That's really helpful. So we talked a little bit about what's different this time around with medication abortion, and probably even just the ease of travel is different. But one of the people in the audience wanted to know if you thought there would still be an uptick in injuries or deaths caused by illegal abortions, and if so, why?
Yes, I do. I don't think it'll be quite as bad as in the days before Roe. But the problem with when you criminalize abortion in states is you make it very difficult for people to get accurate medical information. They just don't have anywhere to turn. And while the internet is great for providing good, accurate information from some folks, it's also a place that you can get rogue information. And women are desperate when they're facing unintended pregnancies, and so self-aborting through non-medical abortion means is always a problem. The other problem I see is that even medication abortion, while it is safe, there is a certain percentage of women who will need medical backup or surgical backup, and that will be hard for them to get. And what I worry about is not just for abortion, but any pregnant woman who gets nervous about these kinds of laws and doesn't seek good medical care or doesn't want to go to the hospital because they're afraid of being accused of having an abortion when they're just naturally miscarrying, for example. All of that is a big problem. And I think anytime you criminalize women for exercising their reproductive choices, you make it more difficult for them to get safe and safe care.
And I mean, and on a positive note, I think that the Black Lives Matter and criminal justice reform movements have really brought us far towards recognizing the dangers of criminalization. I mean, I think that's something that may be different than before Roe as well, is that there's a much greater awareness of the inequity in the criminal justice system. It's, not just public defenders who see it, we're all very aware of it now. And, in Texas, the law very, cleverly did not make the woman a subject of the lawsuit. And in the days before Roe, women weren't. And I think that's right, but it also is, somewhat hypocritical in a way. So, we're seeing a lot of hypocrisy around abortion rights generally. Don't get me started on, opposing vaccines because you don't want me to, don't tell me my body, my choice. And sort of the imitation is the sincerest form of flattery in stealing slogans from the abortion rights movement. But I think that we're almost there with recognizing this more as a human rights and one about bodily integrity.
And one of the people in the audience wanted to know too, if this is going to, on the anti-abortion rights side, if this is going to stop with overruling Roe, or if there's a chance they're going, a chance that they're going to ask the court to recognize fetal personhood, and thereby make abortion unconstitutional. And then also if you think there's a chance that will work, given that we can't trust the court. I guess the question is how much,
how far will they go? I mean, I think that is a question. I think that's the ultimate goal. I think in some ways with Texas, they're a little bit like the dog that caught the car and doesn't know what to do with it. And that they've started a backlash to that, amount of restriction. But I mean, I think ultimately they would like to take contraceptive and make it, go back to the days of, before Griswold and make it only available to people who are married or not available at all. So I think the sky's the limit. I didn't think we would be where we are today. And, if we don't act now, it's only going to get worse.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of this is they will go as far as public opinion lets them go. And therefore, if we don't resist, if we don't begin to take back some of these legislative seats, if we don't begin to say, you can't do this politically, they will keep pushing. And I'm with Julie. I think the first place they're going to push beyond abortion is, two places. One is they're already using trans rights as a wedge issue, cracking down on trans people in all kinds of ways. They're going to go into school boards and try to prevent sex education or quality options counseling in the schools. And I think they'll go after certain forms of contraception that they believe to be abortifacients. So that would be the pill and the IUD. I think that a lot of the bans that are going to pass will have very broad definitions that will allow them to push into that area.
Right. So I guess a good final question to wrap up with would be, if people are listening and they want to do something now, what are things that people who want to get active can do, concretely themselves, today or tomorrow, given that it's, dinner time and they may not have time?
So first and foremost, do something. Find something that you're comfortable doing, whether it means protecting women at a clinic, doing clinic defense, or giving money to the funds around the country that are supporting women in Texas and other states, or whether it's getting politically active. Every person, I say this over and over again, elections aren't every 4 years, which is the way that Democrats have kind of approached this. Elections are every 6 months. There's primaries and general elections in every state. Have friends in Virginia? Call them this week. Big election coming up in November. Friends in New Jersey? Call them this week. Get online and start working those elections and start working them going forward in all kinds of states around the country. You can do anything that you feel comfortable with, but the most important thing is twofold. Have fun doing it. Bring along some friends, so don't do it alone, and just do something.
Yeah, I would say we need to start talking about this issue differently. We need to start talking about it as a right. We need to talk about how fundamental this decision is of whether and when and with whom to have a family or not, and that we really need to not be defensive about it, but really a lot more recognizing that this is the human rights issue of our time, and that we've been put back in a corner and that it's unacceptable. And so, be active and talk to people. And, I really appreciate everybody being here tonight and learning more and doing more. But the more we talk about how exceptional it is that an individual decision about whether and when to have a family is left to somebody else's belief, we should be having that broader conversation about, what's the maternal mortality rate? Why is it so awful in this country? And why is it so disproportionately affecting Black women? Particularly in places like Boston or New York, where we have very advanced medical care. That's the conversation we should be having. We should be, demanding that the federal government doesn't cut subsidies for childcare, that it's finally getting around to coming to recognize after we've all been tucking children in closets during Zoom for the past year or two. These are the issues where we want to move forward to. And so as long as we get stuck in the same old argument about whether there's a right to privacy and depending on the court, we're not going to get there. And so I appreciate everybody who's sort of listening to us, and hopefully, talk to a friend, talk their ear off, and really start moving us forward to where we need to be on this.
And I think we're at time, but I would also say, obviously, get the book, because the book has a lot more kind of detail about things you can do and what may be more or less effective based on everybody's experiences and the history of this issue. So it's a wonderful book. I'd encourage you to read it. And if this is something that you're passionate about, you should definitely take a look.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you all for joining us. Mary, Kitty, Julia, thank you so much for giving this fantastic talk. I'm scared, but I'm grateful to have women like you at the forefront fighting for this and working and researching and educating the public. Thank you for being here tonight and educating the Harvard Bookstore audience. I am incredibly grateful. And thank you to everyone at home who's tuning in and showing up for authors, publishers, and indie book selling. I'm going to echo Mary here and say absolutely buy the book. Julie and Kitty worked very hard on it, and there's a lot of important information, and it couldn't be more timely. There is a link in the chat if you would like to purchase. It's called Controlling Women. Please, please, please check it out. Shop indie, shop local, and the holidays are coming up. Shop early. From all of us at Harvard Bookstore, have a great rest of your night. Take care, everyone, and thank you again.